Yeah, we are live now. Wait, yeah, man, am I audible right now?
You talking to me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, I'm all good.
Yeah, okay, fine. Okay, so let's start with the introduction. Okay, so welcome guys to the HackJaipur. Yeah, should we wait for 5 minutes? Yeah, we can wait for 5 minutes. Yeah, people are coming right now.
Hi, Tejas and Rohit. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm great. How are you? What about you?
I've had a request from Mayank to just start in the private chat here.
Yeah, okay, sure. So, welcome guys for the another session of HackJaipur. So, here we have from Auth0, Ben Dechrai. I think I am saying correctly.
That's great.
Yeah, okay, yeah, Ben Dechrai, and he is a developer advocate at Auth0. He is developer advocate at Auth0 in the APAC region, right?
That's great. Yes.
Yeah, and Auth0 is also a sponsor for the HackJaipur. They are giving out some Amazon credits, and you can see the details on our website also. So, what is HackJaipur? So what is HackJaipur? HackJaipur is basically on the community-focused hackathon. We are the community. We started the hackathons for the community, by the community, so that we can interact with the beginners as well as experts, and so that we can learn and implement new ideas and starting to do things. If I'm a beginner, I can do things. If you are a beginner, you can do things. And it's a start for everyone. So we are creating a space for everyone. That's how HackJaipur is about. So let's start with the workshop. Auth0 powering Node.js.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I've just noticed in the live comments, Venkat, you just asked whether it's a session for beginners. It's certainly aimed at beginners. I'm going to go into some code demos and stuff as well, but everybody should be able to follow along. And if not, we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end as well. I'm just going to switch over to my presentation. So I want to talk to you today about other people's code. It's a hackathon. You're going to be writing code, but there are ways of improving your productivity and making it easier to develop applications in the short time frame that you're going to have. As you've heard, my name is Ben Dechrai. I am a developer advocate at Auth0. My background is very heavily surrounded around security and privacy. It's something that has been a focus of my day-to-day life for 20 years. And I thought I'd throw in a fun fact at the end. My favorite food is Indian and Italian. I don't know that I could choose either way, but I couldn't eat the same thing every day, so I have to alternate. Pasta and sauce or butter chicken, I think. So you can see down at the bottom there as well, I'm on Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, Instagram, and LinkedIn. That list keeps growing. Follow me on any of those. My DMs on Twitter are open as well, so that's one of the better way of contacting me after this event if you want to. Throughout the hackathon, though, I am on the Discord as well, so you can jump in there and ask me any questions if you've got any further questions about Auth0 or just web development in general as well. Happy to help out. Karen's just asked whether or not it's going to be specific to Node.js. It is going to be JavaScript specific, so we're going to be looking at Express and React. We'll come to that in a second. So let's jump in. Why do I want to talk to you about other people's code? There was a study done a couple of years ago that shows that 97% of the code in a modern web application comes from NPM. So you're probably mostly familiar with NPM. It's the package manager that's used for Node. And there are a whole load of libraries that you can just download with a simple command. And that functionality automatically becomes part of your application, which means that there's 3% that you actually write yourself. And when you think about any particular application, a lot of it is common. There are so many things that every application does that you don't have to write over and over again, which means that if all you have to do is focus on 3% of your application, then obviously you're going to be able to build it a lot more quickly. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? There's a link here which will stick around. Oh, it hasn't come down very far. That's ben.sc/npm-2018-review. I'll share that some other way for you as well. And that's a link to the NPM end of year review that they did in 2018 that found these statistics out. So this is from NPM based on their own statistics, so quite accurate, I would say. So we have this big pie. We've got the big stuff on the outside. That's 97% of all the code. And this can include things like Node.js, Express, and React that we're going to be looking at today. But it includes all open source projects that you can find out there, whether or not they're actually available through NPM. There's so much code that's available to the community, written by the community, that you can use within your application. And then beyond that, as well as the code that runs in your application, there's a whole lot of code that you can run that never becomes part of your application. And these are external providers like Auth0, Twilio, Stripe, or Airtable. You can find an off-the-shelf solution, a hosted software as a service solution that will do everything from payments to database storage. So you don't need to worry about not just the writing of the code, but also the deployment and management of these services. So overall, using other people's code will allow you to outsource the management. With Auth0, you don't have to worry about whether the database goes down or the servers go down. We scale across the entire world, as do Twilio, Stripe, and Airtable, and a whole load of other software as a service providers. By having so many clients, we can scale to a degree that you personally, for your application, you could, but it's going to cost you a lot more than it would cost to do through a third-party provider. And at the moment for a hackathon, you're probably not thinking of cost, but down the track, you're going to hopefully develop something that's going to take off. And starting from the outset with something that's going to scale is going to make that growth in the future a lot easier. And of course, you're also mitigating a whole lot of risk. If you didn't use Stripe for payment processing and you stored all your the credit card details in your own database, there's a lot of risk involved in that. Sure, you can do it securely, but do you really want to be spending the time and effort and future employees' concentration on trying to keep something secure when there's a perfectly suitable solution to that already? And even if you're not doing software as a service, even if you did do everything in-house, and Auth0 is a good example. Auth0, there are a whole lot of other identity providers in the cloud, but you can also install your own local managed OpenID Connect, an OAuth2 compatible identity provider. But you're not going to get that outsourced management component. But you will still be able to get to market faster. You won't have to write all that code. You won't have as much ongoing maintenance. You'll still need to patch. You'll still need to make sure the software is secure, but you don't necessarily need to write all of that. And you also benefit from getting increased code audit. If you buy, and this is particular to open source, if you use code that's not open source, then, or you write your own code that's not open source, the only people who see it are the people who use it, the developers who use that code. Whereas when you use any open source application or library, specifically when we're looking at those that are really popularly used, there are so many people looking at that code that security vulnerabilities and performance improvements and feature enhancements and all of these things can happen a lot faster. And there's a reverse to this as well. If outside of the scope of the hackathon even, if you work for a company that uses open source software, consider also contributing back. The software that you're using is only there because the community provides it, essentially. And there are a whole lot of companies already. Some of the very largest companies even do this. They'll allow their developers to work on open source projects to provide enhancements, or maybe they've acquired or not acquired, maybe they're using a package that doesn't quite do what they need right, so they'll modify it. But rather than having to manage a fork of that original code, they'll contribute it back so everybody can benefit from that improvement. So let's look more specifically at the demo that I want to go through today. So we've got our user in the top right-hand corner there, and this user is going to use your application. And what's going to happen in the demo is they're going to come in and they're going to make a request to the React app. So the React app is actually running in the browser, but it's inside this bubble here because it's somebody else's code. There's some refinement and some specific implementation that you've done, but the application is basically based on React. When this user comes in and hits the React app, let's assume they're going for something that's protected, that we need to know who they are. The React app is going to redirect them to the Auth0 login. And the way we do this, and this is where your code comes in. So we're going to go through somebody else's code during the demo, but we'll also be doing some of our own coding because there are specific configurations that we need to do. And the bits in blue there are essentially the bits that we need to configure. We need to configure the domain, which is where we're going to be logging in. We need to configure the client ID, which allows Auth0 to know which application you're trying to log into. We need to configure the audience, which is what allows Auth0 to know which APIs your application is then going to need to talk to. I've just having a look at the comments here, and I'm happy to keep going through these comments and jump in and out. So feel free to stick more questions in if you have them. The question I think is around Auth0 and how that differs from OAuth. Auth0 is the name of the company. OAuth is the protocol. So Rohit has mentioned in that Auth0 implements OAuth2. We use a whole lot of different protocols. We'll support SAML and OAuth2 equally. OpenID Connect is the identity layer that sits on top of OAuth2. So these are all protocols and standards that have been created to allow you to easily implement any kind of identity in your application. And Auth0 provides a hosted solution that lets you integrate that with your application and then do a whole lot of other things on top, like single sign-on and multi-factor authentication and post-authentication hooks so that you can do clever things once people have logged in. All right, back to the code. So we've got this, if you're familiar with React, at the top level around the app here, we're going to be wrapping the app with this provider, which gives information to every component within the application so they can access the Auth0 components. I shouldn't say components because I mean something else from React, the Auth0 mechanism. And then for every component that we want to do any kind of authentication around, we can make use of the use Auth0 hook, which will give information to that component on whether or not the user is logged in, provide user information, even things like providing the link to the logout method. We'll look at this in the code in the demo. So once the React app has determined that the person needs to be logged in, there's going to be a redirect and the user is going to go off to Auth0. And Auth0 is then going to allow them to create an account or log into an account based on a database that Auth0 stores. So you don't need to worry about making sure that the data is secured properly, that the passwords are hashed correctly. We'll manage all of that for you. You can even do something like a social login where you can use Auth0 to integrate your application with an authentication identity component, but then say allow your users to log in with Google. So you don't need to implement the login with Google and the login with Twitter and the login with LinkedIn. That comes out of the box as part of Auth0. So once the user's logged in, they get redirected back to the React app, and the React app can then use a code that's passed along with that redirect to pull information from Auth0, which gives it what's called a Json Web Token. And the Json Web Token will tell React more about the person who just logged in. In fact, it'll get two tokens, a JSON Web Token for the identity, and then a token of some sort, probably and ideally a JSON Web Token, which is an access token, which can then be used to make requests from the React app directly to an API. And then the API will know who's logged in and whether or not they have permission. So using that token, they can make a request. And in our case, we're going to be spinning up an Express API. Express is a package, a module that runs within Node.js on the back end. So Node is the service that we're going to be hitting, but it's going to pass that request on to Express. And Express is going to handle that request and provide some kind of response to the user. But before it does that, it needs to verify that the JSON Web Token is valid. And as part of that, it's going to make a request to Auth0 for a public key, which it can then use to verify that the JSON Web Token is valid and hasn't been modified. And based on that, it can then let the user through or not. And essentially, The blue code here is the only bit that we need to worry about. The gray code that you can see everywhere, this is all from the quick start, and you'll see all of that soon. But the blue code is the main things we need to worry about. Here, this is the link to the public endpoint that provides the public key that we'll be using to verify the Json Web Token signature. And then the audience is the URL of the API that you're hitting, and the issuer is the domain of the Auth0 instance. So this is a very quick top-level overview of how it all links together. And you can see here from the blue components, the amount of code, I don't know, it's probably more than 3%, but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes in the library. The amount of code that you need to modify from the quick start that we'll go through in a second is very minimal. So let's jump straight into the demo now. Oops, wrong key. Let's switch to here. So I've got an empty directory here, and we're going to go through and start from scratch and create a React app and a Express API. So let's start with the React app. We're going to run npx create React app. So this is going to download the create React app module that will allow us to bootstrap a fresh React application with nothing in it yet. While that's going on in the background, I'm just going to open another tab here, and I'm going to make another directory for the API. And we'll just jump in here and create the Express application. So here I'm going to use the Express generator. This one doesn't create the directory for you, which is why I had to create it first. So now we've got, that was very quick, we've got an Express app here now. So I'll just launch Visual Studio Code. We're going to have a React app running on port 3000. That's the default app that most Node applications will run on. This one is also configured to run on port 3000, but we can't have them running on the same port. So we're going to run the API on port 3001. So I'll just hit save on that one for now. The React app is still installing over here, but one of the other things that we'll need to consider is that when the React app makes a request to the API, it's going to be making a cross-domain request. The API and the React app sit on different domains. In this case, they're both local hosts, but they're different ports. So we're going to need to make sure that something called CORS, C-O-R-S, which is a cross-origin request. I can never remember what the S stands for, but basically what we're doing is the API is telling any requesters that they are allowed to make requests even though they're on a different domain. So for that, we're just going to run npm install first of all, just to bring out all of the packages and libraries that Express needs to run. And then we're going to install CORS. And that's done. So now in our, so this is our API here. In our API, we're going to just copy, we're just going to plonk in these two. After the app is defined here, we're going to put in these two lines here. We're basically requiring the new CORS module that we just installed, and we're just going to tell the app to use the core module without any extended configuration. And what this means, you could put in configuration in here to say which other domains are allowed to make requests to this API, but we're just going to let anybody make a request to this API. That's fine. So I'm just going to come in here and run npm start. So we now have our API here running on port 3001. And by now, the React app should be installed. Yeah. So let's go into this one here and start another instance of Visual Studio Code. So this is now our React application over here. The first thing we'll want to do, let's just run the React app so we can see what's happening. And this should now launch a browser automatically. And here we have, there we go, brand new React app. So for anybody else who's installed a React app from scratch, this is what you'll get. This is not what we want though. So let's make a couple of changes to this. First thing I'll do is we'll jump into the React app here, into source, into the main application. We've got the image here and the text saying edit this file to reload. I'm just going to replace all of this code and we'll go through it. So the difference here is that we can see the differences highlighted by these colored bars here, which is nice and useful. So we've added in useState. useState is a way for us to remember and update variables within the application. And we want to remember a response. And I've replaced all the content down here with just a button, which calls the call API method. And then we print out whatever the response is. And when you click on the call API method, we're going to use fetch, which makes an HTTP request to another service. We're going to request the user's endpoint on port 3001. We're going to grab the text out, and then we're going to set the response value in the web page to be equal to that text. If I just open this port 3001 users, you can see that what's coming back is just some plain text. We don't have any data in there. We don't have any JSON. It's just a plain text string, which is encouraging us to go into the application and make changes. But we'll leave it like that for now. So if I save this, that's the changes I made to the React app. And we come back to the React app now. You can see it's automatically reloaded. We've got the button called Call API and the API response. If I click on the button, we get the text back that was returned by the API. And if we open up the network tab here and click it again, we can see the request goes through. The response is just this plain text. And in the headers, you can see here that we've made this request to port 3001. In the response, I wonder whether we can see it somewhere. We should be able to response headers. Here we go. So here's the cause response. Access control allow origin. Basically, because we installed cause, the star there means that any origin, so any domain, any port can make a request to this API, and it's going to get a response back. All right. So we now have a React app and an API. It's nothing pretty, but we can see that it's working. Next thing we want to do is add some security around this. So the first thing I'll do is jump into the React app here. I'm going to stop the server for now, and we're going to install some more modules. We're going to install two in particular. We're going to install React Router, and we're going to install the Auth0 single-page app JavaScript library. React Router here is a way for you to provide multiple different URL routes, like /account/ whatever, those parts of your domain. And because it's a single page app, it needs a different way of routing these requests to render the correct content. We're not going to be looking in depth at how React Router works, but we are going to be using a component from React Router called history in order to be able to redirect users back once they've logged in to the correct URL. So that's the main reason we're adding that in there. So we'll install that. Meanwhile, I'm going to jump across into the browser again. Let's go to auth0.com. We're going to have to create some things within the dashboard for us to configure the React app and the Express API. So this is a cleaned up version of the dashboard. If you create an account today, this is what you get. You have a default app, and under APIs, you'll have the Auth0 management API. We're not going to worry about this today. Basically, what this does is allows you to modify all of the settings in the dashboard via an API, and this gives you that key. We're not going to be touching that, so we need to create a new application. We'll call it My App. I'm going to select here the single page application because we're working on a React app. So single page app, we'll go in and create that. And you can see that the first thing that happens is we're given a suggestion of which platform we might be using in order to do a quick start. So we're doing a React app. Let's just jump in and see what it tells us to do. So the first thing we need to do is configure the logout URL, the loud web origin, and the callback URL. This is a security mechanism that makes sure that only your application can use this Auth0 login mechanism. If anybody else could use this mechanism, then you could potentially have a third party logging in using your users and get information out that perhaps shouldn't be possible. So we do need to jump into settings here and configure these. So the callback URLs are going to be this one here. That's the application we're running on. So for the callback, we go back to localhost port 3000. We can log out and go back to port 3000, and anything on port 3000 is able to make an initial request for the login. That's what these three are saying here. Just jump down to the bottom, hit save, and then we can go back to the quick start and carry on. So we've done these here. Now we need to create the sample application. We've done that already, and install the dependencies. We were doing that in the background. So I mentioned before that we're going to be using this history library from React Router. If we create source utils history.js, paste that in here. This is doing nothing other than allowing us to keep an eye on what's gone into the history, and we'll see how that's used in just a second. This is where the magic happens. This is the Auth0 React wrapper. So that's React Auth0 spar.js, React Auth0 spar.js. What this is doing, if we come to the top, it's pulling in the Auth0 client method from the single page app library that we have. And then it's creating an Auth0 provider and an Auth0 context. And what this means is that by wrapping the provider around the whole application, it's basically injecting context around the authentication status. Like, are they logged in? How do they log in? What are their user credentials? Things like that. It's wrapping all of that around the whole application. So every component in your application now has access to the context that defines the state of Auth0. I'll come back to that in a second after we've done a few more steps. So the next thing we want to do is to have this one's called Navbar, but essentially what we're doing is we're just creating a login and a logout button. So we'll do that as part of the Navbar, just because I want to follow this guide as closely as possible to show you that you can implement this in much the same way quite easily. So this was components navbar.js. So I'll just come in and I'll create a new file, components navbar.js. We'll paste this in. So we're now using the React Auth0 spar, this file here that we were looking at that provides the context of the system. And what that does is it gives us access to this hook. And this hook will allow us to pull out, in this particular case, 3 specific items that we want. We want to find out if the user is authenticated. We want a handle to the method that allows us to tell them to log in with a redirect. So that's going to redirect them off to the Auth0 site, and a handle to the mechanism that will allow them to log out. So in here, we're basically saying if the user is not authenticated, show a login button. And if they click on it, take them to login with redirect. If the user is authenticated, show the logout button. And if they click on it, call the method that's called logout. So it's as simple as that. I say as simple as that. I mean, for anybody who's not overly familiar with React, this probably looks a little bit confusing. And I know it took me years to get comfortable with React. But the underlying principle is the same. If you're using the library, whichever framework you're using for your application is going to give you similar access to these bits of information around the current user's status that you can then use to define how your app renders and works for your users. So this is the bit that I mentioned before that I'd come back to, and this is where we wrap the Auth0 provider around the application. So I'll just jump into the source index first. So this is the index page here. The way React works is that, and the way most Node applications work, is the main file that gets loaded is index.js. So when React launches, it launches this file, and this is basically the very root setup of your React application. It's pulling in React and the React DOMs, that's the document object model that React creates in order to generate the output of your web application. It's pulling in your app, which is defined in app.js. So this is the file that we changed before with the button and the API response. So it's pulling your app in. And then what it does is it calls the React DOM, and it says that it wants to render something. The default is to render the app wrapped in this strict mode tag. We're going to change all of this. So now what we're doing is we're going to render the app wrapped in the Auth0 provider. The Auth0 provider is pulled in up here from the Auth0 wrapper file that we created before. So essentially what we're doing now is saying that everything in your app has access to this provider. So there's a couple of other things that I want to add in here. This is enough for you to be able to require authentication within your app to use your app. We also want to use this authentication mechanism to be able to use a token against a third-party API. It's still your API, but it's third-party to this application. So for that, we need to define an audience. So I'm just adding this in here, which means that when Auth0 gets launched, when we try and log somebody in, it's going to pass in there the fact that we want an audience as well. And in fact, what I'll do is I'll just comment it out for now, because before we do this, I want to show you the login working before we start playing with the API, just so we don't skip too many steps ahead of ourselves. Final two things we need to do are to provide the configuration. So in here, we were pressing in config.domain and config.clientID. These are pulled in up here from this authconfig.json. So we need to create that file. And we're going to paste this in. Now you'll notice the client ID, I just copy and pasted from the documentation. This is the client ID of the current Auth0 configuration that I'm working on. The Auth0 documentation is what we call live documentation. So this is actually correct. I don't need to modify this from copying and pasting. If you're copying and pasting documentation from elsewhere, you might need to make sure your client ID is correct though. And then finally, we created the navbar. We actually need to show it in our application. At the moment, we still don't have the navbar in the application. So let's go into the app here, and we'll make sure that the navbar is included. So now if we switch back to here, refresh, of course, I'm not running it. So let's just start the server again. Excellent. So this is why we always want a bit of extra time when we're doing live demos. Right, let me have a look and see what's going on. So we've got our navbar, which is pulled in from here. Got our Auth0 config. That looks fine. I reckon maybe that's breaking it. Let's see if that's it. Yeah, it is. So you obviously can't put a, yeah, if you think about it, this here is like an HTML tag. You can't put / something in there. That's ridiculous, Ben. Okay, well, I'm glad I found that one quickly. Right, so we now have a login button down here. If I click on this login button, it takes us off to the Auth0 domain up here. So this ben-dechrai-test, that's what we call a tenant. So within Auth0, I have a tenant called ben-dechrai-test, and anything inside of there is totally under my control. Auth0 doesn't see into it, and no other Auth0 clients can see into it. We've identified the fact that I want to log into an application, and we need to authorize it. Now, in most cases, you won't want to see this if you're just logging into a standard web application. If I was not running this demo on localhost, this would not pop up. But because it's localhost, it pops up. It's just one of the things that we do to increase security, because localhost doesn't really specify the end application as such. So I'm just going to approve that. And we can see this login button will change into a logout button. And if I open up the network tab here, I just log out again and log back in, we'll see one of the things that happens down here is this request right here, right at the bottom. Let's see if I can make that any bigger. There we go. So this request right at the bottom here to the Auth0 domain, requesting a token. So because I've just logged in, we're getting this response back. So you can see here the ID token. This is a Json Web Token. And JSON Web Tokens look a little bit like this. There are three parts. The red part here is the header, the purple part is the payload, and the blue part is a signature. The red and purple parts are base64 URL encoded versions of JSON. So anything can decode it and read them. You can get the sub, which is the subject, or the name of the person who just logged in. And the blue part is the signature based on these two, which means that you can be assured that the data hasn't changed. So if I just paste in the token that we got, oh, not that one. I copied the URL instead of the actual token. Let's try that. There we go. We can see in here that I've logged in. My nickname is Ben. Auth0 has determined that because it's taken it from the start of my email address. It's been able to determine that I have a Gravatar URL based on my email address. It knows when my account is last updated, whether or not my email has been verified. When I logged in the first time, I would have received an email saying, please verify your email. It can tell you who the issuer is, so which service provided this token to us. So these are all things, and also an expiry. So you can see here, I'm not sure whether you can make it out, and I can't make the tooltip any larger, but the expiry there is June the 16th at 3:33 Australian Eastern Standard Time. So that's going to be my math isn't very good at the moment, but we're looking at about 12 hours maybe. That expiry is also configurable. But we don't need to know what's going on inside the JSON Web Token. I just wanted to show you what one looked like so you understand the kind of information we're getting. But you'll notice here that the access token is not a JSON Web Token. It's not long enough. It doesn't start with EY. The EY there is the open brace that you'll see in JSON. So this is not the access token, what kind of access token we're looking for, which means that we're not going to be able to use it within our application. I won't go into details of why this is different at this point, but the reason it's different is because we haven't specified that audience. So I started in here with adding this audience in. What we're doing at this point is we basically want to define that within the config here, we want to define an audience as being the other, or the API that we're going to be making requests to. So that's going to be on localhost port 3001. So what we're saying is when you give us a token, we want this domain to be one of the other audiences. So if we log out now, so that we can log in and create a new token, let's just check I saved this file. Save that. We log in now. Okay, the reason this has failed, and if I look to the log files, you'd see the error, which says the audience is unrecognized. And the reason for that is that we haven't defined it in the APIs yet. So let's create the API. Applications here within Auth0, these are all your front-end applications. This will be your mobile apps, your web apps, your Siri applications, anything that acts like a client to the service and needs to be able to allow somebody to log in. An API is purely an API endpoint. It doesn't require a login mechanism. It just needs to know, it needs to be known within Auth0 that this API exists and is allowed to look at the JSON, or is allowed to be a recipient of the JSON web tokens that are generated. So let's come in here and we'll just call it API. And we'll define as localhost port 3001. And that's all we need to do. So now if I come in and I hit login again, we should get the login form. And now, if we look down here, the token that comes through, we can see the token is now a JSON Web Token. So let's just have a look and see what an access token looks like when we consider JSON Web Tokens. I've done the same thing again. Come here. Copy. Paste. There we go. So in this case, the access token is slightly different. You can see here we've got our audience. The audience there, this is to get more information about a user from Auth0, but this is the important one. Our API is now an audience for this token. So we can now issue this token to the API, and it can use it as an authentication mechanism. So how do we do that? Let's jump back into the code over here. I'm going to just close some of these tabs because we don't need them all. So we now have an application that's got login, and we can tell in the nav, we can tell here whether or not the user is authenticated. What we want to do in the app.js is do the same kind of thing. So we're going to pull in, let me just check all my notes, make this easier. I'm going to pull in this get token silently. So we're going to pull that out of the Auth0 helper. What this function does is it allows us to get an access token from Auth0, and the silently means that we're not going to redirect somebody to log in. We're not, if there's no token available, we're just going to fail. Given that we've just logged in, there should be a token available. The other thing, the other thing is that if the token hasn't been retrieved once, then it'll obviously make a request to Auth0 to retrieve it. If it's already in the application, it's not going to make another request. Get token silently will just return the latest token that it knows about. So we're going to make a call to get token silently. And the result of this, it uses promises. So the result of this is a callback that's going to provide us a token. And then we can run some code around that. So the request to the user's endpoint, we now need to provide that as a bearer token. So we're going to add in some options that we want to provide to the fetch call here. So the first one is the URL. The second one is the extended information. And in this particular case, we want to pass in headers. The header we want to pass in is authorization. And the value we want to pass in is bearer, followed by the token. Now, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a catch here, because if this fails, then I want to know about it. So the API might have a failure of some sort. So we'll just do, so far I've been using the set response here to update the text in the main page. I'll just reuse that one. So we'll do set response, and we'll say there was an API failure. And then I also want to put one around the get token silently in case that one fails, just so we can see what's going on. So set response token failure. Let's save that. Auth0 is not defined. I'm just going to import that. We just needed this line in here. Save that again. All right, and we're running. So let's drop back here. So we're going to log out first, so we don't have a token. I'm going to make a call to call API. And you can see here it says token failure. Despite my inability to type, the token has failed. The main reason for that is that when we made this call to get token silently, it didn't work. So let's log in again. Now when we call the API, we get the text straight back from the API. And if we have a look at the call that was made down here, we can see the responses come back. If we look at the headers, we can see that the authorization bearer token was passed in. So now we've managed to log into the React app, and we've got this token, and we're passing it into the API. And again, as you'll probably have noticed, the amount of coding I've actually done, copying and pasting aside, the amount of actual coding I've done is probably, I don't know, 10 lines so far. The downside is that if I go back to the API here and I hit refresh, it's still providing it without me having to authenticate into this browser. So we need to make sure that not only is the React app making sure that I'm logged in, we need to make sure the API is also verifying this Json Web Token. So this is the React app. I'm going to switch over to the API here, and I'm going to stop the API for now. And we're going to add some code into the API to allow us to verify the Json Web Tokens. So at this particular point, we're not looking at specific Auth0 libraries. We're looking at generic Json Web Token libraries. So this would apply to any JSON Web Token from any identity provider. We're going to install the Express Jwt extension or module, which allows Express to look at JSON Web Tokens, verify them, and change operations and functionality based on the outcome of that. And JWKS-RSA, which I'll just install and I'll show you some code, because it'll be an easier way of explaining to you what that particular bit of code does. So that's installed now. So after this point here, where we had the calls, I'm going to add this bit of code in. So the first thing I've done is I've required the 2 new modules that we've installed. And then we're going to define this Jwt Check object. And it's going to call Jwt, which is part of this, that's the Express Jwt library, with some configuration information. And what we're configuring is the secret. So when the JSON Web Token comes in, if you remember when we looked at what the JSON Web Token contained, it had a signature. In order to verify the JSON Web Token hasn't been modified, we need to verify that signature hasn't changed. And in order to do that, we need the public key that's used to verify the signature. This public key is provided at this endpoint here. This URL will never change. For anything trying to log into Dechrai test.auth0.com, this URL will always provide the public key required to verify a token. If that public key ever changes, then the response to this endpoint will also change. We pass in the audience saying we need to make sure it's applicable for the API we're looking at. We pass in the issuer saying it has to be issued by this particular identity provider, and we say that it has to be an RS-256 algorithm. If we allowed other algorithms in here, there are potentially some security vulnerabilities. So we always specify one and only one algorithm based on how we've configured the Auth0 setup in, if I can find my browser, in here. And finally, we just tell the app, which we've defined up at the top here, the Express app, to use Jwt Check. And what this is going to do is say every single request has to be accompanied by a valid JSON Web Token. There are ways of doing it so you can just have certain endpoints protected, but for the purposes of the demo, I'm just going to protect the whole API. So I'm going to hit save and restart the server. And now when we come back to our API endpoint here, if I hit refresh, we've now got a no authorization token was found message because we're not providing an authorization token. However, if I come over here and I call the API again, we'll see the response down here. We're actually getting the text back. And just to be absolutely certain that nothing's cached in here, I'm going to come in and I'm going to change the user response here. And we'll say this is now a secured endpoint. Just need to restart Express again. And now when I call the API, we get secured endpoint. So we're now at a point where within, I don't know, 20 minutes of coding, following a step-by-step tutorial and just modifying some of the code to be specific around your configuration, we've got a secured React application, login mechanism, and a secured Express API endpoint. So, wrong button yet again. That's essentially it. Oh, sorry, just got distracted by some comments. I'm open to questions. I will be sharing this code, so I'll find out from the organizers the best way of sharing that link with you. The code itself, though, is not going to be overly useful to you because it's very specific to the implementation that I had. By following the quick start guide that I showed you on the Auth0 website and copying and pasting the live documentation in, you should be able to get to a point where if you already have a React app, you can add that security in. And of course, this is particular to React as well. If you're using Angular, or even if you're doing something like Ruby in the backend, there are quick start guides for each of those. So I'd recommend you have a look through the documentation. But of course, the code will be available to you to download and play with. Thanks very much for your time. I'm Ben Dechrai. You can contact me at, as I mentioned before, at Twitter, direct messages. Also, ben@dechrai.com will come to me. I'll hand over for questions. Thanks. Just going through the comments here, so I can see there that Krusty and Pratik have asked for the code, so I will share those with you. They'll be going to a GitHub repository, and I'll share those links through.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Ben. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I just loved it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Cross-origin resource sharing. Thanks, Venkat. I also remember the acronyms, but I can never remember exactly. As long as you remember the acronym and what they do, that's the important part, right? I think.
So we are open to questions. I hope please typing your questions and clear your doubts with the Ben, so that you can understand the code and the documentation from the Auth0 live documentation.
Even I can see many students asking for the code. Is it possible to provide the code?
I'm sorry, I'm finding it very hard to hear that. It's very crackly.
Okay. He's saying everyone wants the code to share on the GitHub
Yes.
GitHub link. So is it possible to share the link?
Yes, I've said that I will upload this to GitHub, and I'll find a way to share the link. That's
Yeah,
not a
sure.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Many of the most of the audience are pretty much want to get the code.
Yeah. But like I say, I mean, by all means, I will share the code, download it, have a play with it. But remember that it's a particular implementation. For your particular applications, you might be able to start off with my API and the React app and go from there. And that's fine if that's what you want to do for your project. But if you wanted to use other technologies, then the documentation exists for plenty of different tech stacks at the auth0.com website.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the code will be shared soon. Yeah, the code will be open source soon, and we will share the link after the workshop. And it's okay. And I don't think I have much more of the question on for Auth0. I think
That's all right.
that's all right.
Well,
Yeah.
like I mentioned before, thanks. Like I mentioned before as well, I'm around on Discord. If anybody's got any questions, you're welcome to do that, whether it's Auth0 or general hackathon related. I'll be around.
Yeah, I think we have a question from Rishabh. How we will be getting Auth0 account? Simply signing into the website, or is it available for free?
There is a free. So when let me just get this out. If I log out, when I clicked on login, right next to the login, okay, auth0.com. Head to auth0.com, and then let me just share the right camera. So up here, you've got the sign up button. Just click on that, and it takes you through for the sign up process. There is a free tier. It's not a trial or anything. It's free for life, depending on the usage that you have. If you have fewer than 7,000 monthly active users and you want to use 2 social logins and a couple of other things, they're totally fine on the free account.
Awesome, Ben. And I guess we don't have any more questions. So thank you so much for joining us and taking out your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for your time. It's been fun.
Yeah, same here. Like we will be sharing the certificate link to everyone. And like Ben, I will share the feedback with you.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. And I'll get that GitHub link to one of the organizers as soon as possible to share it with the rest of you.
Do share it on the Discord channel. I've shared the Discord link with everyone.
Okay, I'll do that there. Thank you. Have a great time, everyone.
Thank you.